welcome. My name is Denny Paul May, and we'll be doing the new emerging teacher cadre on progress monitoring today. Um, if you notice up at the top of the screen in the left-hand corner, you've got a QR code that also will allow you to download this presentation. Should you want to keep this and download it on your personal computer, you're certainly welcome to do that. Our learning intentions today is we're going to look at what the IEP guidance document says about progress monitoring. We're going to talk and try to establish an introduction into the purpose and the components of progress monitoring. We'll discuss some tools. We'll make some connections to Infinite Campus through some screenshots, and we'll just talk about, what it is that we're doing with progress monitoring, why it is that we're doing progress monitoring, and how we know if we're doing what is needed for students. So that's our intentions. Certainly going to talk you through this and also let you do a little practice on some things. So let's just talk about progress monitoring in an overall sense here. Progress monitoring, well, it is our evidence on IEP goals. Students with disabilities have IEPs, and we are also understanding that students with disabilities are afforded a free, appropriate public education. And in order to provide evidence that we are providing that free, appropriate public education, we have to collect and analyze data, and we have to know what we're doing in terms of how we set the current level of performance, and where that current level of performance is important. And when we establish that in our present level, then we've got something that helps us write our goals for our students. And those goals then can be measured and can be monitored, and it can be our evidence that we've done the specially designed instruction, and here is the proof that this student is headed in the right direction. And so really, it's kind of the capstone project, if you will, for everything we do in terms of IEP development and monitoring and providing instruction that is above and beyond the core instruction that all students with disabilities also get. And so that's what we're talking about. And when you look at this slide, a lot of these slides and a lot of this information is taken either from the IEP guidance document, or it's taken from some screenshots from Infinite Campus. And so when you go to the IEP guidance document, you'll see this. And what they're trying to say here is this is a cyclical process. This is something that's ongoing. Once we get progress, once we establish goals that have a baseline percentage, then as we move through the process in a year's time, we're going to look at our present levels and say, can we definitively say we know where this student is currently functioning within the parameters of the Kentucky academic standards? And then also, how are they doing on those skills that we've pulled out that we feel are going to make a difference over that year? And how are we going to be able to say through a visual representation that we can say that they're trending toward making the proper amount of progress, and that we can review that in a year, and that we can start right back over with the process again. And we'll talk a little more about that as we move through, but it says progress monitoring. This kind of defines it as an ongoing process of collecting and analyzing data to determine student progress towards specific skills or general outcomes outlined in the measurable annual goals. So you have to have a basis for every goal that you write. And that baseline is going to be that starting percentage. And so then once you start charting your data points, then you can see, is the student making progress toward reaching the goal, or is the student on the wrong path, and do we need to make some changes? So when we look at that, then we say, well, what's the purpose of progress monitoring? It's to prove that we're doing something with the student. Yes, it's to prove that we're providing the FAPE, but it also goes a little deeper than that. when we do this, we collect and analyze data, we determine student progress, we look at IEP goals, we help with instructional decisions, and it helps us, informs us on a daily basis. What do we do next with this student? What do we do that is intentional for this student toward the goal? What specially designed instruction are we providing? And how can we represent this for our parents to be able to see that the student's making progress and that we can say, yes, we're doing something that means something for this student and they're headed in the right direction toward closing that gap on that goal or closing that gap on that skill. And it's just a process that we have to go through. And it's really, really not all that difficult if we understand how to do certain things. One is creating that baseline, finding where that baseline is coming from. And so baseline data for an initial IEP are based on student performance data, evidence-based intervention data, and instructional data. Baseline data for subsequent IEPs are based on IEP progress monitoring data. Now, that's a lot of words, okay? So first of all, let's establish, do we understand what an initial IEP is? That's the first one, right? Pretty simple. So the initial IEP is one that, you're going to look at evidence-based intervention data, you're going to look at instructional data, you're going to look at student performance data, and you're going to use that psychological report to help you determine, where is this student functioning? Where are the problem areas? What are the needs and concerns of this student? And when we look at that, then we can either take that information straight from our RTI or our MTSS program, and we can use that in our present level to set a baseline on a particular skill. If it's reading words, how many words we can read in a minute? If it's how many words can we read from a list, what percentage can we get from that? And so we have to turn everything anecdotally into something that we can measure. And in order to do that, we got to put numbers with those anecdotes. And so on that first one, we may be looking at student performance data or RTI data that is available from the process that students should be involved in all the time, because they should be involved in universal design for learning in the core instruction, and they should be involved in some type of tier, and they should have differentiated instructional strategies. And when they've not made progress and then we find them to be eligible, then we look and we say, okay, what's the data telling us? Where are we situating this student? What level are they on? We've got to be able to determine in that present level where they're actually functioning. And we use the standards as a guide for the skills that we need to be working on. And we are trying to close those skill gaps. Now, sometimes I'll go out and I'll be in the field and I'll be looking at folders. And I'll see folders that sometimes people have the mistaken thought process that those goals need to be written on grade level. Well, now, if we're writing goals where students are on grade level, then there's probably not a large enough gap for them to need specially designed instruction. And so in order to be eligible for specially designed instruction in an IEP, you have to have a disability, and then you have to have a gap that's great enough that's going to warrant something special. And that's what we're talking about. We're going to monitor that something special part. And so in the subsequent IEPs, we're talking about any IEP that comes along after that first one's established. Then we're looking backwards at the end of that cycle. That's why it was kind of, when you go back to that previous slide, you see that it's cyclical in nature. We go back and we look back at progress data from that previous IEP and we say, okay, we've been working on this goal and this student is currently reading on the second grade level. When we ended the cycle, when we started the cycle, they were reading on first grade. Now they're reading on the second grade level. So the question for you guys then would be, where would we write the goal for the next IEP in terms of that reading level? What would be something that we would need to take into account there? It's obvious to us that, we would need to move up and make some decisions based on pushing that student into a zone of proximal development where they're going to feel a little uncomfortable, and we're going to push them with some ambitious goals. So we don't want to write goals on grade level. We want to write goals where, and meet the student where they are in light of their unique circumstances. That comes right out of the Andrew case. And so on those subsequent IEPs, we're looking back at that progress data and we're saying, hey, where did they end up? And then what do we need to do with that data? And that's what should be talked about. Students that have IEPs are going to be behind, grade level performance. And so we're doing what we can do special for them to close that gap. And so when we look backwards to that progress from that first IEP, where did they end up on that cycle? And so we'll have a conversation like, okay, if they ended up at only 30% of the goal met, and the goal, the independent goal was we're shooting for 90%, then we still got some work. And maybe we can say, well, that goal remains appropriate because we need to continue to work on reading comprehension or word reading. And so that's really what we're talking about there, is the difference between an initial and a subsequent IEP. If we're looking at student ending up at, let's say, 90%, they're getting 90% of the words that they're supposed to be reading on the second grade level, then we would move to the third grade level. We'll just jump to the chase here. And so then we would probe that student on the third grade level work, and we would see what the percentage was based around that. And we would use the same method of measurement every time. So once we get that method of measurement started and we're not changing that goal any, it's okay to keep that goal, the skill, the same, but we have to make sure that we are looking at what particular level that student is on. Okay. And they may be in the 5th grade, but they're working on 3rd grade level. Okay. And so that's something that we have to really, really establish as we move through. One of the other things that we have to do with developing the baseline is we have to look at this thing called mean and median. And so, sometimes in special education, you'll be sitting there with a caseload, and that caseload will be one that, okay, you've had the same kids for several years. Okay, you're sitting there with the same folders, but then all of a sudden you get a transfer. Okay, you get a transfer in. They say, oh, we got a new student coming in, and the previous school indicated they have an IEP. Okay, and so, but then when you get the IEP, there's not any data in there. Okay, there's some information that says that student's behind in reading comprehension. It may even tell you a grade level, but what you'll need to do there is then you'll need to probe that student on that particular skill that you're going to make a goal for. And so you'd write that goal for that student by using the median. Okay, so you would take a bunch of measures in a short amount of time on that same skill with that same method of measurement, and you would you say take those numbers, and in a single collection you would list those scores from lowest to highest or highest to lowest, and you would take the middle number in the median presentation there. So if you had scores of, let's say, 38, 38, 34, 36, and 32, you've got a pretty good set of scores there as far as the kid being in that particular area. So you could take the middle score of those 5 scores, and that 36 would then be your baseline. Now, if you have an even number of scores in that data set, you would calculate the middle 2 scores to come up with a median score. Now, if you're doing a collection over time and you're just working with students you've had on your caseload and you're setting a new goal and you're going to probe that student on that particular skill, and you do that over a couple of weeks period of time, and you don't have an outlier score in that data set, then you can use the mean. You can just add the raw scores up and divide by the number of scores or the number of probes that you've done. Now, the other time that you would use a median is if you had a data set where you had, let's say I was giving you like 38, 36, 34, 32, but then you had a 90 in there. Okay, that's an outlier score. That's going to skew that number and that data to where that baseline is going to be a lot higher. So that's, you're going to get that student started off on the wrong foot. So you need to throw that score out and then take the middle score of those 4 scores, and you would have to average the 2 middle scores to get that. Another thing that you have to consider is the method of measurement. That method of measurement is those particular tools that you'll be using. Okay. And we're going to show you some examples of methods of measurement here in just a second. But let's just talk about methods of measurement for a second. This is the evaluation method of measurement is one of those components that you have to embed in your goal. It's one of the 6 components that are required by the IEP guidance document. And so when you look at evaluation method measurement, you are looking at how the implementer measures the student progress toward each goal. What tool do you use? And that tool selection needs to be practical, and it needs to yield information that can be easily analyzed. And it doesn't need to take a long time. Okay. It is something, that it's going to provide you the date of the measurement. When you do effective data collection, it's going to measure the behavior outlined in the annual goal. So we need to be astute at matching the method of measurement to the particular verb that you're trying to measure. So if you're going to measure the student's ability to read words, you're more than likely going to do a direct observation there, or a direct measurement, which is what is in the Infinite Campus drop-down box. But then you're also going to say, well, what do I hope to get from that data? Am I going to do a frequency count? I'm going to see how many times that student can read those words, or what percentage of those words that they're supposed to be reading can they get this time on this particular level? So I'm asking myself some of those questions, and will it measure the verb? That's the biggest question. And sometimes we use frequency count, sometimes we use checklists, sometimes we use a running record, and so we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move through. It should just be a quick check. And so when we talk about instruction, you're doing special design instruction, and you've got a little mini lesson on word reading, and you're going to measure whether or not the student's getting the phonics instruction, and they're going to increase their number of words read. Then, it should be just a quick check. 1 minute, can you read this word list? That type of thing. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about, in the data should emerge from the natural flow of instruction. And it shouldn't be something where, unless you're not with that student consistently, it would be probably ineffective to say, okay, Friday is going to be day to day. That's the day we're going to take data. We're going to bring you in here and test you. Well, that puts a lot of pressure on the student. Plus, that's not telling you a lot about your instruction. It's not giving you any clues as to where you need to go next. And so one of the purposes of progress monitoring is not just to prove that the student's making progress, but it's also to help you look inwardly at your instruction and whether or not you need to make adjustments to your SDI, which is another outcome from doing progress monitoring. So right here's what we were talking about. When you have, this is what kind of looks like in Infinite Campus. When you've got a drop-down box there, that method of measuring it, it'll say either a curriculum-based measure, a direct measure, indirect measure, authentic assessment. Now we kind of stay with curriculum-based measures, and we match that word curriculum-based measures to the word probe. We'd want to just put probe in the body of our goal. And then if we're doing direct measures, those are measures where you're sitting with the child and you're seeing the child and you're right there with them and you can see them do that. And then those indirect measures are those things that are going to produce like permanent products, where you're going to, maybe a homework assignment, or maybe somebody else is grading an assignment that the student has done. But certainly this is a screenshot that shows you, you have right here methods of measurement in the center of this screen right here, and the 4 that you have. But when you are up here in your writing your goals, we want to see things like an oral reading fluency probe, or a work sample, or a rubric, or a point sheet. And then, you need to be also explaining to folks what it is you're using and how that's being used and how you're going to get, because in the new guidance, or in the new record review document, it says that you tell the parent how often you're going to report progress, but then also how you're going to report progress. So that part of that how is really looking deeply into what method of measurement you're going to be using and explaining that to parents and putting it into words that parents can understand. So anyway, enough about that. And again, here's the goal where we've got the frequency count embedded, and we've chosen a direct measure from the drop down box. So we just want to show you that that's kind of the expectation that we have, and that we are not only are we putting that there, but we're also using a word here that may not be understandable to parents. So we need to make sure in our conference summaries and in our ARC meetings that we're explaining these things to parents, so they'll know what they're getting when they get that progress report. That's important. And so they can see that, yes, my student's making progress on these goals that we're working on. So in Infinite Campus, there's three really particular types of data that you're taking, or you're going to turn all your data. So like it's either going to be a frequency count or event recording, a duration recording, or a latency recording. Now, a frequency count is basically you're just counting how many times a behavior occurs, right? Or you're turning some type of verb into a measurable term. And so we're going to record how many questions the student gets right out of how many possible. We're going to look at a word list and say, okay, they're getting 20 out of 100. And so we're going to turn that into a percentage. And so if you use a checklist and the student is getting 4 out of 8 of the items on the checklist, you're eventually going to turn that checklist into a frequency count or an event recording where it makes sense that they're getting 50% of that correct at this point. Now, a duration recording, lots of times we use a duration recording in behavior when we're thinking about how long does a behavior last. So we would measure from the beginning of the behavior to the end of the behavior and see how much time a student was able to sustain attention, or, you know, those types of things. And then a latency recording is you give a student a prompt and you're measuring how long it takes that student to respond to that prompt and get started with the work. And so those are the three types that go in. So a curriculum-based measure is an approach using probes to measure the growth of student proficiency. Probes are brief time samples made up of academic skills taken from the general curriculum. CBMs can be standardized to provide valid and reliable indications of student progress. So that's what a CBM, that's a curriculum-based measure. And like I said, when you choose that one, that's going to be things like oral reading fluency probes. It's going to be math fluency or writing fluency probes. Those are the types that would fall under that, taken from the curriculum, but it's a measure of how many words can they read on a particular level within a time constraint. That's when we should be using that with curriculum-based measures. And when we say that, we're to say, we're going to do an oral reading fluency probe and put that in the body of the goal. And so you can see here, those are the three: oral reading fluency. And this is straight from the guidance document. Okay. A measure of students' rate and accuracy and phrasing and intonation is oral reading fluency probes. And, how fluent can you read is really an indicator later of, it's going to have a great impact on your comprehension. And then math computation probes, how accurately can we complete addition, subtraction, multiplication, division? And we start working with, and I'm not a math specialist, but we're looking at automaticity. How can we reduce the cognitive overload so that we can do the higher order and get to that top end of Bloom's taxonomy? And then math concepts and application probes are measures of math reasoning, accuracy toward performance of place value, time, money charts, graphs, and problem solving. So those are what we're talking about here. And here's just a screenshot of one that we might use, an oral reading fluency probe. This also looks a lot like a running record, where how many words is on that line, and you're going to give that student a probe for a minute. You're going to see how well they read this, and you're going to mark it and with the substitutions and omissions, and then you're going to be able to determine how many words were they able to read in 1 minute out of this list right here. And that's really a curriculum-based measure, and that's an example there. And then we have direct measurements. It's a direct observation of student performance. We're with the student here in this particular example, and you can see that frequency accounts and event recordings fall under there, as well as checklist, running records, latency recordings, and duration recordings all kind of fall under that direct measurement umbrella. So the direct measures, frequency count, that's the number of times a behavior occurs during a specific consistent time period. And we can also apply that to if we're seeing how many words a kid can read, that type of thing. And so the duration recording and the latency recording are lots of times are used when you have a descending measure, when you're looking to decrease behavior and you're looking to place those negative behaviors with positive behaviors. A lot of times, if you're working on special factors and you got a student's OHI and you're looking to see, hey, are they doing what they need to be doing with this student? Because that's what I say. I use this old phrase, you got to dance with the one that brought you when it comes to disability, okay? So if you get an IEP based on other health impairment, then you have to look at behavior measures. A lot of times we're looking at a descending line, and when we start to look at the methods or the screenshots from Infinite Campus, I don't have any descending lines, but it's going in the different direction. You start with in most cases we're starting with when we're measuring word reading, we say, okay, he can get 20% of the words, so that's his baseline, and we're trying to get him to 80. So that's a line that's going up, or ascending line, or it's and then a descending line is where we would use the duration recording, latency recording measures. Here's an example in a screen capture of a frequency count recording or an event recording, and so all you're doing is taking the time the behavior started. During journal writing activities, Joyce makes comments to herself or to others unrelated to the academic material. So that's the target problem. And so then we would say, okay, when does the behavior start? When did the behavior end? And how many times did we see that the behavior occurred? That's a frequency count as well. And then we would see how long the observation was and what the rate was. And you can do a little bit of a further analysis there with that particular screen. Here's another duration recording. During independent math activities, Kaylin engages in off-task behaviors, which refer to any behavior lasting 5 seconds or longer that deviates from teacher instruction. And so she's looking around the room, playing with her hands or playing with the objects, or maybe she's interrupting a neighbor that's working. But we'd see, when did that start? When did it end? And what's the duration time for that behavior? And so we would plot that on our progress monitoring graphs. Here's one that's filled out for you. So you can see what we're getting to here is that behavior is lasting 6 minutes in that very top line from 8:30 to 9:30, and enter the time when the instruction is given, 8:46, and when did the behavior start and how long did it last, and that type of thing. So that's what we're talking about with a latency recording. We're saying, okay, we gave instructions to start at 8:46, but the student didn't get started until 8:52. So there's a 6-minute latency. So we're trying to decrease that latency. We're wanting them to respond quicker, right? And so we start taking that over time. We've got 2 here on the 5th and 2 on the 6th. We're taking that a couple of times a day, and then we're seeing. And you can see that you can see the example here of how important it is to take more data with behavior lots of times in order to get a true representation of how the student is doing. So then indirect measures involves using scoring criteria to review student performance and can supplement direct measures. And so we have all of these are examples: the rubrics, goal attainment scalings, checklists, teacher interviews, and those types of things. Scoring guides are all examples of indirect measures. The student's not with you here. The student's going to do some work somewhere else, and you're going to grade it somewhere else. Okay. So permanent products and teacher-made tests and homework and those types of things are what we're talking about with indirect measures, or maybe somebody else is instructing the child and they're also assessing the child, and then you're going to gather that information and do that at a later time. So there's an example of a rubric that we use in writing. Quite honestly, we use that a lot now in writing instruction. There's adults third grade data sheet with all the words on there, and you can see how many words they get correctly and put the date in there. And you can do the whole list, or you can do part of the list, or do so many, and say you can turn that into a percentage. Eventually, you would turn that into a frequency count. But that's an indirect measure as well. Somebody else could be doing that for you, is what we're getting at there. And then here's your permanent product, just an account of how well the student did on their homework out of the number of opportunities. And then you would turn that into that last column, a percentage. So there's three types of data in Infinite Campus. And so we kind of organize this for you just so you could get see it. And this comes straight out of the guidance document as well, as to what types of probes, what types of recordings go under the particular areas that then turn into data on the progress monitoring. Let me go back to that for just a second. On the progress monitoring in Infinite Campus. So what we're saying is you can use all these different examples, but you eventually are going to turn it into three different types of data. You're either going to turn it into a percentage that you can count and measure, and that's going to go under an event or a frequency count, or you're going to measure how long a behavior lasts, or you're going to measure how long it takes a kid to get started. And that's the only three types of data that we can use in Infinite Campus. So that kind of simplifies it a little bit. And so when we see IEP goals with components, it's okay to include like a checklist under direct, but then we have to know what the checklist is going to look like. And you have to communicate that to everyone, what the checklist, what the expectation of the checklist is. And maybe you break that down in your short-term objectives, and you talk about the behaviors that are supposed to occur in particular. If they're stair-stepped or foundational skills that you're working on, then you would make that readily apparent to all the ARC members. And so when we how do we capture data, and what does it look like? So we collect, graph, and interpret progress data to make instructional decisions, and to also tell us when a student's going to make progress, or when we need to make a change, or maybe we need to change a goal. Those are the things that we're talking about. And so we use a graph, and we identify the method of measurement used to collect the data. That's what we have to do. Okay. And so when reviewing progress, evidence should include a graph and identify the method of measurement or the tool used to collect the data. Pretty simple stuff we've already talked about, and we've shown you examples. So we want to go back and say, you know what? All of our Infinite Campus, in the old days, we used to send a progress report home, and we had a checkbox, and the student is making progress. Okay. Now, what we want to see is a graphical representation with dates and data points. And we want to see, is there a trend toward making progress, or do we need to change something? And then we need to analyze that data and make sure that we're communicating that to all the ARC members. So what's required on a graph? A graph should contain a title. It should contain or an indication of what the baseline or the starting point is. You should have your goal on that graph. You should have an aim line, a desired rate of progress. Okay. So your aim line is going to go from your baseline to your expected percentage performance that you're trying to achieve, and then your trend line is going to be your actual progress data. And we're going to see this in just a second in an actual representation. Data points with dates to include the month, day, year, and they must match the frequency defined in each measurable goal. So when you write a measurable goal, you'll say you're going to take data weekly. You're going to take data every 2 days or every 4 days. You're going to take it 3 times a month. So anytime we send a progress report home, we should be sending a corresponding visual representation with a graph that has all this information on it. And so that frequency matches. So if you say you're going to take data weekly, then your dates across the bottom of that graph are going to be separated by 1 week, So you start, today's the 13th of December, 2023, and we're going to take weekly data. So we can assume that there's going to be a data point on the 20th of December and so forth. All right, so here's just a cartoonish looking representation of a graph. This is not actually what you would see in Infinite Campus, but it does get you some information here that you can see how it should be looking. Okay, we got a name line on here. We don't have a trend line, but you can see that now in Infinite Campus, you just set the baseline separately. Okay, but in real time, you've got to determine what the baseline is, and you've got to have a starting point. That's why I wanted you to see this. So if we're doing reading words per minute, we can see that this student is going to be somewhere around 40, and they're trying to get to 80, right? Because that's the aim line. That's the expected rate of progress, and we can see that as a ascending line. We can also see that when we start to put those data points in, that they're taking data here inconsistently, okay? So it's going to be hard to match this set of dates up with a weekly representation or an every 3-day representation or an every 4-day. What are they doing? So we put that in there intentionally to see a non-example of how you would have your dates arranged along that horizontal line on the graph. Okay, so let's move on here for just a second. So you can see that they used a median score there because they only had 4 scores, just kind of reinforcing some of the things that we talked about before. You can see that they appear to be trending toward reaching that 80%. So, and then you can see that they made an instructional change here because the student dropped below that aim line for 3 consecutive data points. So you got some rules in progress monitoring, and those rules are typically, if you start to see a student drop well below the aim line for 3 consecutive or 4 consecutive data points, then you would make an instructional change. You would talk about that in your analysis, and you would indicate that with a vertical line on your representation. So here we have an actual screenshot. And so I said, let's practice a little bit. So if you were, Faith, if you were looking at this particular representation, and you see that the baseline started at 40, and the aim line here is to get to 70, and we see that the student is, the blue dots are representative of the actual data points that's being taken. And then we see down here at the bottom, we've got a 913, a 920, a 927. We can say fairly that they've got that correct, right? We've got the baseline in there at 50. And we see that the student is, did I move? I moved that. I didn't mean to move that. Yeah, I jumped ahead here. I'm sorry. Okay. So, so we were looking at this and we're saying, okay, the student is making some progress here. They started out at 40. The first probe they did, they got 40. And we can see that the data jumps way up there for a bit. And so we start to ask ourselves the question, specially designed instruction must be working really, really well. and this, or either the goal is what? What would you think, Faith?
I would think the goal was probably not an accurate representation. So it's too low.
Yeah, it's too easy for the student, isn't it? If you start to see those data points way up there, he's already at 80 and we're just trying to get to 70, right? So as
Yeah.
we analyze that, we'd say, okay, what do we need to do here? So what would you think you needed to do, Faith, right there, if you were the practitioner here?
Well, probably set baseline at around 80. Well,
Okay.
if there's more dots around 80 at 80, if not about 90, but also space out a little bit more, or even like space out the dates, or even just do a new baseline
It's
goal.
really unfair to ask you that question because you don't have the goal, right? You don't have the goal, so you don't really know what they're working on. If this is reading instruction, about a week of data points, a weekly data point check with reading instruction is a good probably approximation of when you should be. And of course, you need to have some instruction that occurs with the student to see if the student can respond to the instruction. So with reading, if this was a reading goal, and we're going to assume it is, and we see him jump way up there, then what I would take away from that would be maybe that the reading material is a little bit too easy. So we might need to back up and say, oh, wait a minute, we might need to make this goal a little harder, right? Is that fair enough?
Yeah.
And so, or maybe we've got too much support. Maybe we're accommodating this student too much. Maybe we have too many scaffolds in place and we need to adjust our instruction in that way. And so if we're way above that aim line and we do that for about 4 consecutive data points, we need to start looking at our instruction. We need to start looking at the student. And one of the things that we can do is just go back to the table and change that goal, right? We can just go back and say, okay, this goal's way too easy for this student. But first we would look at ourselves. We would look at that specially designed instruction. And then, like I said, that representation is all over the place. When, it's interesting that as they move across here, they start getting a little closer to, with the trend line, a little closer to the aim line, So it makes you wonder what happened with the instruction where that student dropped that back down to about a 70 there. He's trying to get to 80, right? But he's had about 3 data points around 70, and then he jumped back up. So it's kind of all over the place. So we have to analyze that and say, what is it that we need to do with the instruction? What is it that we need to apply to this? Because those data rules that we're talking about, anytime that student's well above the aim line for 4 data points or more, or sometimes 3 data points, we need to start looking inwardly at our instruction. And then the takeaway is that the goal may be, or the instruction, the current level that we have this student working on may be a little too easy for that student. So let's look at another one. We put the goal in here this time. When given multi-step equations at the 4th grade level, we're going to say, wow, this student's way, way above. Like they only have 3 data points in there. So the jury's still out, but it's way above the aim line right here, which you're trying to get to 80. And so we would definitely have to look at that and reduce some support and change our instruction. Now we got another one here, and we can see that this student, although they dip below around 10.4, 2023, we can see that they're trending toward reaching that goal, right? We're trying to get to, looks like that might be the aim line's not in there. And so that trend line though is showing us that student is making progress. So we would have to go back and say to that particular practitioner, where's your aim line, right? Where's the aim line? Because so they've not appropriately placed, probably, if you're looking at Infinite Campus, you first have to make sure that you get your baseline set appropriately. And so I'm thinking that this particular screenshot, the teacher did not set the baseline appropriately. So there's not been enough information placed into the Infinite Campus in order to get us all of the things that we need. Because you see, the key is you got to have a data line there, and that's the actual probe points that we're taking for that student. And then there's no red line for intervention. There's only a trend line and no aim line. So that tells me that this teacher's done something wrong here, and we need to go back and check to make sure that we've input the data correctly, that we've put the data in there correctly, and that we've first established what the baseline is.
Right.
And so it's basically with Infinite Campus, you're just inputting raw data once you figure out what the baseline is, and then you're keeping up with those data points. Now, at the bottom of this screen, if I had the whole screenshot, I don't have the whole screenshot, there's a place for you to put analysis. And so if we went back to that previous one right here, we'd say, boy, we got to take a look and maybe go back to the table. If we look at the one here, then we would say, you know what, he's well above the aim line. We've got to reduce supports. Now, I have another one over here, I think, and maybe that was the last one. But I had one, I thought I had one, but if we had one where the student was well below the aim line, okay, and you had 3 or 4 data points where the student was well below and he was trending in the wrong direction, let's say the trend line was descending, but we were trying to get to an ascending goal, then what would we do? So let's think about if you've got a kid trending well below the aim line, and you've got data points there's 3 or 4 weeks, and that student's clearly not trending toward reaching that goal. We have to look at our instruction, and we have to change our instruction. We have to update our supports. Okay. We may have to rescaffold things. We may have to. The student's clearly not getting it.
Right.
So we're checking for understanding. And that's why you do this progress monitoring. Students not getting it, we got to know what to do in our instruction to make sure they are getting it. Because we've done and we're using, that's why you use the same method of measurement. You keep that baseline the same, and you see how the student does based on your instruction. But you have to give them the instruction, especially design instruction, and see how they respond to it. And so if they're well below the aim line, then we're going to put a vertical line, a red intervention line in there. And in our analysis, we'd say, okay, unless something's going on with this student, unless something's going haywire in their life, for lack of a better way of saying it, unless there's been a death in the family, or the students missed several days of instruction, or the students had a breakup with a girlfriend or a boyfriend, or, traumatic things happen to our students, and they are in high school or middle school or elementary school, and these things are real to them, right? And so they may not be the end of the world to us, but they're the end of the world to the student. And so we got to look at what's going on in their life. And then we also have to look inwardly at our instruction. Is our instruction not working? If instruction is not working, we got to put an intervention line in there. And that's something you can do. You can tweak that specially designed instruction without a meeting. Okay. You can do that and make those adjustments on the fly. That's a purpose of progress monitoring. But if you change that goal, like in that representation that we showed you before, where the student was way above, like on that one, or he's way up there 4 straight data points, that goal's too easy. We may have to call an ARC meeting.
Right.
Change that goal, because that's going to require a change in the services. And so anytime we change anything with FAPE, we got to let that parent know, and we got to have a meeting and say, hey, we set that goal way too low. We need to do more with the student. And so that's really what we're doing with progress monitoring. Now, the other thing that we do with progress monitoring is we analyze that data. Frequent analysis is critical, and it's to determine the things that we've talked about. Where is the student functioning? What's going on in the student's life? How's the student responding to the specially designed instruction? Are they making gentle steady progress toward attaining the goal. If they're not, we got things that we have to do. When a student's not progressing, this is the type of information that we need to send home to the parent. John's currently not on target to meet his goal. His data indicated that an instructional change was needed due to scores dropping from 52 to 45. On 1/25/2019, repeated reading was added as a strategy to teach reading fluency. So you can see what needs to go in that analysis. Students not making progress, so we made an instructional change. After 3 more data points, choral reading was added. He still wasn't making progress, but we're making those instructional changes. He's close, but he's not progressing the way we want him. Another instructional change was required due to scores dropping from 45 to 32. Since this strategy has been implemented, John's skills increased to 48 from 45. Progress will continue to be monitored utilizing this instructional strategy. So that's one, is students not progressing, but we're making instructional changes and we're starting to see him trend back in the right direction. And then you got one where the student's progressing, but then you also see what we did here as far as analysis is at the beginning of the reporting period, he was not making progress toward his goal in reading fluency. We had scores of 49, 48, 45, 48. Paired reading was added as an instructional strategy to increase reading fluency. Since that strategy began, he's increased his scores to about 62%. And the 2 most recent data collection opportunities have shown a decrease, but we would say, okay, he'd missed several days of school with the flu. So that's the explanation of why we saw a dip after an increase. Then we saw a dip based on what's going on, special circumstances in the student's life. And then we got a student meeting the goal based on data. Charlie's currently exceeding her articulation goal. She began this progress reporting period producing S sounds in all positions of words at 63% accuracy and is now producing them at 80% of the time. And is now producing them 80% of the time. So the focus will now be on generalizing this skill across academic areas. She's met the goal and we need to move on. We need to look at it. Does she need other goals? Does she need to be dismissed? What's going on with that in speech, right? So that's what we're talking about there. And then the last thing is that we do this at the end of the IEP cycle. We do an annual review analysis once a year where we would look at all the things. We'd say where the student's baseline was at the beginning, what progress they made on the goal, what SDI we utilized, what strategies were effective, and what changes were made to that student's instruction. We would explain any significant decreases or increases in progress and what the maybe special circumstances were. And then we could also talk about, that ESY, that extended school year determination. If a student can't recoup skills after an extended break within 6 weeks, then the student would be a candidate for extended school year services to maintain their goals. And so that's why we have to have progress monitoring in order to answer that ESY question on the IEP. We have to look and analyze that data to see how they did before a break and how they did after a break and how they were doing 6 weeks into the future after that break to see if they could recoup to the level that they were before that break started. A lot of times we're looking at summertime here, or we're looking at a Christmas break of 2 or 3 weeks. And we're saying, okay, the student was at this level. Now they're at this level. We can expect a little dip, but can we instruct them for 6 weeks and get them back to that level? So that's another outcome of annual review progress monitoring. And so that needs to be in your conference summary. It needs to be documented in your conference summary that you reviewed the progress and what you were doing that was working so that you can write the goals for the next IEP cycle. We appreciate you being with us. There is an example of a end of the year analysis. Wanted to throw that in there with you. Like I said, you've got this presentation. If you want to use that QR code, you can download that and keep that with you. And just want to say thanks from Brenda Combs and myself and all the people here at KVEC. Progress monitoring goes a long way in determining FAPE and making sure that we're doing what we need to do for students so that we can make instructional decisions and we can determine if they're making progress on those IEP goals. That's what we're progress monitoring. Thank you so much. All right, we're going to sign off then. progress monitoring is complete.